Rain hammered against the hospital windows, each drop echoing the beeping of life support machines. In room 407 of St. Mary's Hospital, 12-year-old Sophie gripped her brother Thomas's hand, their identical blue eyes fixed on their mother's pale face. Kiele Dumont, once vibrant and full of life, lay motionless, her breath shallow and uneven. "Mom, please," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "You promised you'd never leave us." Sophie remained silent, her jaw clenched tight against the tsunami of emotions threatening to break free. The doctors had explained it: clinically internal bleeding, severe trauma, minimal chances. But how could mere words describe watching your whole world slip away? Through the window of the ICU, a man stood in the shadows of the corridor, his expensive suit at odds with his disheveled appearance. Robert Durant's hands trembled as he watched his children, the twins he'd never acknowledged, the family he'd abandoned. He'd followed them for years from afar, sending anonymous donations to Kiele through various channels, but never finding the courage to face them. Time of death. 9:47 p.m., the doctor's voice cut through the rain's rhythm. Sophie's scream pierced the hospital corridor, a sound of pure anguish that would haunt those who heard it for years to come. As nurses rushed in, Robert slipped away, his cowardice winning once again over love. But this time, his retreat would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of the Durant family forever. In his mansion across town, Paul Durant, industrial magnate and Robert's estranged father, received a cryptic message: "She's gone." The children are alone. His hand crushed the paper, memories of past mistakes weighing heavily on his conscience. He'd driven his son away, and now his unknown grandchildren faced the same fate of abandonment he'd once inflicted. Back in the hospital, Sophie held Thomas as they huddled together on the cold floor, their world shattered beyond recognition. "I'll never let anyone separate us," she promised fiercely, unaware that forces beyond their control were already in motion. Above them, through the rain-streaked window, the lights of New York City blinked indifferently, while somewhere in that vast metropolis, two men, father and son, wrestled with decisions that would either heal or destroy what remained of their broken family. The world was about to discover that sometimes the deepest wounds are inflicted by those closest to us, and the path to redemption is paved with both sacrifice and forgiveness. For Sophie and Thomas, this was not just the night they lost their mother. It was the beginning of a journey that would test the very bounds of family, love, and forgiveness. New York City 2025. The contrast between wealth and poverty had never been more stark than in the stretch between Fifth Avenue and East Harlem. The Harrison House Orphanage stood as a stark reminder of this divide, a weathered brick building wedged between luxury condominiums that seemed to scrape the sky. Inside one of the orphanage's shared rooms, Sophie sat by the window, watching the privileged world outside with sharp, observant eyes. The room itself told the story of America's forgotten children: 6 beds with thin mattresses, metal lockers that had seen better decades, and walls painted in what Mrs. Martinez called institutional beige, but was really just the color of resignation. 3 blocks away, the Durant Tower cast its shadow over the neighborhood, its gleaming glass facade a monument to the success of Paul Durant's business empire. The same empire that Robert Durant had walked away from 12 years ago, choosing love over legacy only to abandon both in the end. The neighborhood itself was changing, like most of Manhattan. Small businesses that had served the community for generations were being replaced by artisanal coffee shops and boutique fitness studios. Mrs. Martinez often said that even poverty was being priced out of New York. The Harrison House remained only because of a long-term lease and the persistent advocacy of its director, Elizabeth Harrison, a formidable woman who refused to let developers buy out the last refuge for children who had nowhere else to go. For Sophie and Thomas, Harrison House represented both shelter and prison. The strict routines, shared spaces, and constant supervision reminded them daily of what they'd lost. Their room, shared with 4 other children, was their only sanctuary. Here they could maintain a small shrine to their mother, a worn photo album, her favorite scarf, and the silver locket she'd always worn, now containing a picture of the 3 of them from happier times. The neighborhood's gentrification created an odd dynamic. Local businesses that once welcomed the orphanage children now posted security guards at their doors. The new residents complained about the institutional element in their expensive neighborhood, as if tragedy was somehow contagious. Yet there were still holdouts like Mr. Chen's grocery store, where the twins could always count on a friendly smile and occasional free fruits, or MS, Rodriguez's laundromat, which still washed the orphanage's linens at a discount. This was the world Sophie and Thomas navigated daily, a world of stark contrasts and subtle cruelties, where their mother's absence felt more acute with each passing day. From their window they could see both the highs and lows of the city, the chauffeur-driven cars dropping off private school students, the tired workers waiting for buses, the hungry artists dragging their portfolios between galleries, and the bankers in tailored suits rushing to their next meeting. Unknown to them, they were being watched. From his office in Durant Tower, Paul Durant had instructed his security team to keep an eye on his grandchildren, while somewhere in the city, Robert Durant taught at a public school under an assumed name, carrying the weight of his choices like a hidden wound. At 12 years old, Sophie Durant had already mastered the art of emotional fortress building. She moved through Harrison House with a calculated grace, her long dark hair pulled back severely, her school uniform always impeccable despite its second-hand nature. Where other children her age sought comfort, she sought control. Her teachers called her remarkably mature, but Mrs. Martinez recognized it for what it was, armor forged in the furnace of loss. In class, Sophie excelled, throwing herself into academics with an almost desperate intensity. She maintained straight A's not out of ambition, but because it was something she could control when everything else felt chaotic. Her greatest strength, her fierce protective instinct toward Thomas, was also her deepest vulnerability. She'd taken on their mother's role, checking his homework, ensuring he ate properly, defending him from bullies with a ferocity that sometimes frightened even herself. Thomas, despite being Sophie's twin, was her polar opposite. Where she was steel, he was silk. Where she calculated, he felt. His artistic talent manifested in sketchbooks filled with portraits of their mother, drawn from memory and photographs, each one capturing a different aspect of the woman they'd lost. His teachers worried about his tendency to drift into daydreams, but they couldn't deny the emotional depth in his artwork. Unlike his sister, Thomas wore his heart openly, making him both beloved and vulnerable at Harrison House. He befriended new arrivals, shared his meager possessions, and somehow maintained an unshakable belief that their family story wasn't finished. This optimism both irritated and secretly comforted Sophie, though she'd never admit it. The twins' bond transcended ordinary sibling relationships. They communicated through glances, finished each other's sentences, and instinctively understood each other's needs. Yet their approaches to grief couldn't have been more different. Sophie processed their loss through action, organizing their belongings, creating schedules, maintaining routines. Thomas processed through art and emotion, his sketchbooks becoming journals of their journey through loss. Their differences emerged most clearly in their attitudes toward their unknown father. Sophie's anger toward him was a living thing, fueling her determination to succeed without him. She'd torn his name from their mother's old letters, refusing to even speak it. Thomas, however, secretly kept a folder of newspaper clippings about Robert Durant, collected before his disappearance. He studied these articles for traces of himself in this stranger's face, looking for answers Sophie refused to seek. These contrasts created a delicate balance between them. Sophie's strength protected Thomas's gentleness, while his emotional openness prevented her from becoming completely closed off. Together, they represented both sides of their mother, her determination and her compassion, her strength and her sensitivity. Yet as they approached their 13th birthday, this balance was about to be tested in ways neither could anticipate. At Harrison House, relationships formed and dissolved like watercolors in rain, but certain bonds held fast against the tide of transience. Mrs. Elena Martinez, the head caretaker, had developed a particular softness for the Durant twins, though she maintained strict professional boundaries. Having worked at Harrison House for 20 years, she recognized in Sophie a familiar pattern: the child forced to become a parent too soon. Sophie, Mrs. Martinez would say during their evening rounds, "You don't have to carry everything alone," but Sophie would just straighten her shoulders and continue with her self-imposed duties, checking on Thomas, organizing their shared space, helping younger children with homework. The elderly caretaker saw how Sophie both sought and resisted her maternal guidance, creating a complex dance of need and independence. Elizabeth Harrison, the orphanage director, watched the twins with growing concern. Her weekly reports to child services noted both their resilience and their isolation. While other children formed shifting alliances and friendships, Sophie and Thomas remained in their own orbit, connected yet separate from their peers. MS. Harrison's attempts to integrate them into group activities met with mixed success. Thomas would participate, while Sophie observed from the sidelines, ever vigilant. Among their peers, the dynamics were equally complicated. Michael Chen, a 14-year-old resident, had appointed himself their unofficial protector, sharing his computer time and smuggling extra desserts to them. His own sister had died years earlier, and in the twins, particularly in Thomas, he found a chance to be the big brother he'd never gotten to be. Sophie tolerated his presence because he respected their boundaries and never pressed for confidences they weren't ready to share. Sarah Williams, their English teacher at the local public school, recognized their academic potential and fought to get them placed in advanced classes. She saw how Sophie used academic achievement as a shield and Thomas used art as an escape. Her gentle encouragement provided a stability they desperately needed, though Sophie remained wary of growing too attached to another potential source of loss. In the background, unseen but ever present, Paul Durant's influence manifested through anonymous donations to Harrison House, specifically earmarked for educational programs and facility improvements. Elizabeth Harrison suspected the connection but kept her counsel, understanding that sometimes silence protected more than truth. These relationships formed a delicate ecosystem around the twins, each person playing a role in their survival. Mrs. Martinez provided maternal warmth, Ms. Harrison ensured institutional protection, Michael offered peer support, and Mrs. Williams nurtured their talents. Yet all of them recognized that the twins' strongest relationship remained with each other and the memory of their mother. As autumn turned to winter, these relationships would be tested by the arrival of new information about the Durant family, forcing everyone in the twins' orbit to confront difficult questions about loyalty, truth, and the real meaning of family. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 6 months after Kia's death. Sophie was organizing their mother's remaining possessions, a ritual she performed monthly, each time hoping to find something new to hold on to. In a hidden compartment of their mother's old jewelry box, she discovered a bundle of letters, yellowed with age and tied with a faded blue ribbon. Thomas, she called softly, her hands trembling. Her brother looked up from his sketchbook, immediately sensing the gravity in her voice. Together, they sat on Sophie's narrow bed, the letters between them like a bridge to their past. The first letter was dated 12 years ago, written in their mother's elegant handwriting. My dearest Robert, I know your father's ultimatum has placed an impossible choice before you. But there's something you need to know. I'm carrying our children. Sophie's hands clenched, crumpling the paper's edges. Thomas gently took it from her, continuing to read. Twins, the doctor says. I want you to be part of their lives, to know the joy of feeling them kick, to share in the miracle we've created. Your father's threats mean nothing compared to the love we could share as a family. Letter after letter revealed a story they'd never known. Their mother's desperate attempts to reach Robert, his father's intervention, the private investigators hired to keep them apart. The final letter, never sent, dated just weeks before Kia's death, carried a different tone. They ask about you, though Sophie pretends not to care. Thomas draws pictures of what he imagines you look like. I've protected them from the truth for so long, but they deserve to know their history, their heritage. The Durant name belongs to them as much as it belongs to you. Sophie stood abruptly, pacing the small room. He knew, she whispered, her voice sharp with betrayal. He knew about us all along, and he still stayed away. Thomas remained seated, clutching a photograph that had fallen from between the letters, a younger version of their mother standing beside a handsome man with their own blue eyes, both smiling at some forgotten joke. Maybe there's more to the story, Thomas ventured, earning a fierce glare from his sister. What more do we need? He abandoned us. His father threatened Mom. They're all the same rich people playing with others' lives because they can. Sophie's voice cracked with emotion. Outside their room, Mrs. Martinez paused in the hallway, overhearing the conversation. She glanced at the newspaper she was carrying, featuring an article about Paul Durant's latest charitable donation to children's causes. The pieces were falling into place, and she worried about the storm that was brewing. In his office at Durant Tower, Paul Durant received a message from his security team. The children have found the letters. He closed his eyes, knowing the careful distance he'd maintained was about to collapse. The time for secrets was ending, but he feared the truth might destroy what little chance he had of making things right. The discovery of their Durant heritage affected the twins in profoundly different ways. Sophie threw herself into research with obsessive intensity, spending hours in the school library scanning old newspapers and business magazines. Each article about Paul Durant's empire or Robert's disappearance felt like a personal affront, evidence of the privilege they'd been denied. During sleepless nights, Sophie would stand before the mirror, analyzing her features with new bitterness. Her blue eyes, once a source of pride for their resemblance to her mother's, now reminded her of Robert Durant. She began wearing her hair differently, trying to minimize any resemblance to the Durant family photos she'd found online. Her straighter grades, once a shield, became a weapon proof that she could succeed without the Durant name or money. Thomas, meanwhile, retreated deeper into his art. His sketchbooks filled with new drawings imagined scenes of family gatherings that never happened, portraits of Robert at different ages, studies of Paul Durant's face from newspaper photos, searching for traces of himself in these strangers' features. Late at night he would whisper to Sophie, maybe they had reasons, maybe they regret it. The weight of their newfound identity affected their relationships at Harrison House. Sophie became more isolated, rejecting attempts at friendship with a newfound harshness. She overheard whispers about the Durant orphans, and responded by working harder, staying up later, pushing herself to prove she needed nothing from anyone named Durant. In contrast, Thomas began asking Mrs. Martinez questions about wealthy families, about fathers who leave, about forgiveness. His artwork took on darker themes: empty chairs at dinner tables, shadows in doorways, half-finished family portraits. His teachers noticed the change. The way his usual gentle optimism became tinged with melancholy. Their mother's absence felt sharper now, filled with new questions they could never ask her. Why had she kept their father's identity secret? Had she forgiven him? Had she truly loved him? Sophie found herself talking to Kayla's photograph at night, demanding answers that would never come. Thomas would wake from dreams where their mother tried to tell them something important, her voice always fading before he could understand. The knowledge of their heritage created a subtle strain between the twins for the first time in their lives. Sophie's anger clashed with Thomas's yearning for connection, creating silences where there had always been understanding. They still sat together at meals, still shared their private jokes, but something had shifted a fault line in their once unshakable unity. During their weekly counseling sessions, required by Harrison House, both twins refused to discuss their discovery. Sophie would sit in rigid silence while Thomas drew intricate patterns, both protecting their secret with fierce determination. Yet their counselor noted new tensions in their body language, new shadows in their eyes. The Durant blood in their veins had become both a burden and a mystery, forcing them to question not just their identity, but their understanding of love, family, and belonging. The tension between Sophie and Thomas finally erupted one evening in their shared room at Harrison House. Thomas had been working on a new drawing of family portrait that included Robert and Paul Durant alongside themselves and their mother. When Sophie saw it, something inside her snapped. "Stop trying to create a family that doesn't want us," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet room. "They're not some lost relatives waiting to be found. They're people who chose, every single day for 12 years, to pretend we didn't exist." Thomas carefully set down his sketchbook, his voice quiet but firm. "Mom always said there are two sides to every story. Maybe they didn't know how to find us. Maybe Grandfather Durant threatened them, like the letters said." "And that makes it okay," Sophie demanded, pacing the small space between their beds. "Rich, powerful men couldn't figure out how to contact their own family? They own half of Manhattan, Thomas. They could have found us if they wanted to." "People make mistakes," Thomas insisted, his usual gentleness hardening into something more resolute. "Even big ones. Maybe they're sorry. Maybe they've been looking for a way to make it right." Sophie turned to him, her eyes blazing. "Sorry doesn't make up for 12 years. Sorry doesn't bring Mum back. Sorry doesn't erase all the nights she worked double shifts to support us while they lived in their mansion on Fifth Avenue." Their argument drew Mrs. Martinez to their door, but she held back, recognizing this as a necessary confrontation. Inside, Thomas stood to face his sister directly. "I'm not saying we should forgive them," he said. "I'm saying we should at least try to understand. Mom kept these letters for a reason. She wanted us to know the truth someday." "The truth?" Sophie laughed bitterly. "The truth is that Robert Durant was a coward who chose money over his own children." The truth is that Paul Durant is a manipulative old man who'd rather break up a family than risk his precious reputation. The truth, Thomas countered, is that you're so afraid of being hurt again that you won't even consider the possibility of healing. Mum wouldn't want this for us, Sophie. She wouldn't want us to live with this much anger. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie stared at her brother, as if seeing him for the first time, this gentle boy who suddenly showed steel beneath his softness. Thomas met her gaze steadily, neither backing down nor attacking. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't lose you too." "You won't," Thomas promised, "but we can't let fear of loss stop us from finding answers. We deserve to know our whole story, not just the parts that fit our anger." Outside their room, Mrs. Martinez wiped away a tear, understanding that the real battle was just beginning, not between the twins, but between fear and hope, between the safety of anger and the risk of reconciliation. Autumn fog clung to the headstones in Woodlawn Cemetery as Paul Durant made his weekly visit to his wife's grave. Through the mist, he noticed two small figures kneeling before a nearby headstone, a sight that stopped him in his tracks. Even from a distance, he recognized them from the surveillance photos, Sophie and Thomas, his grandchildren, paying respects to their mother. Paul remained hidden behind a large oak tree, his heart pounding as he heard their voices carry through the morning air. Sophie was speaking, her tone fierce despite her obvious tears. "We found the letters, Mum," she said, placing fresh flowers on the grave. "About Robert Durant, about his father, about everything. I wish you'd told us." Thomas knelt beside her, adding a small sketched portrait to their offering. Paul felt his chest tighten as he heard his name spoken with such bitterness. He watched as Thomas touched the headstone gently. "Do you think they ever think about us, Mum? Do they know what happened to you?" The question pierced Paul's carefully constructed defenses. Of course, he'd known his investigators had informed him immediately of Kealay's accident. He'd anonymously paid all the hospital bills, covered the funeral expenses, ensured the twins had spots at Harrison House. But he'd maintained his distance, trapped by decades of pride and fear. Making a decision that would alter all their lives, Paul stepped out from behind the tree. "They think about you every day," he said quietly. The twins spun around, Sophie instantly pushing Thomas behind her in a protective gesture that reminded Paul painfully of Robert at their age. Recognition dawned in their eyes. They'd seen his photos in their research. "Paul Durant," Sophie stated, her voice cold enough to cut glass. "Come to check on your mistakes." Paul took another step forward, stopping when he saw Sophie tense. "I've come to apologize," he said, "though I know words aren't enough." "You're right, they're not," Sophie snapped, but Thomas placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Why now?" Thomas asked, his artistic sensitivity picking up the genuine pain in the old man's bearing. "Why after all this time?" Paul looked at Kealay's headstone, then back at his grandchildren. "Because I'm tired of letting pride destroy my family. Because your mother deserved better. Because you deserve better." "We don't need anything from you," Sophie declared, but her voice wavered slightly. "No," Paul agreed, "you don't. But perhaps you need answers. And I'm ready to give them, if you're willing to listen." The fog swirled around them, three people bound by blood and separated by choices made long ago. In the silence that followed, even Sophie could feel the weight of this moment, a crossroads where the past and future collided, offering either healing or deeper wounds. The initial meetings between Paul Durant and his grandchildren took place in the neutral territory of MS, Harrison's office at Harrison House. Paul arrived precisely on time each Wednesday afternoon, dressed immaculately but carrying himself with a humility that surprised the staff. Sophie sat rigidly in her chair, while Thomas sketched in his notebook, occasionally glancing up to study their grandfather's face. "I've arranged for a trust fund for your education," Paul said during their second meeting, only to be cut off by Sophie's sharp response. "We don't want your money, we want the truth." All of it. She pulled out a folder of carefully collected newspaper clippings. "Why did you threaten our mother? Why did you drive Robert away?" Paul looked at the articles, recognizing the stories that had painted him as a ruthless businessman. "The truth isn't always what's printed in newspapers," he said carefully. "I made terrible mistakes with your father, with your mother. Pride and fear of scandal drove my actions, but the consequences," he paused, looking at Thomas's latest sketch, a hauntingly accurate portrayal of their grandmother, drawn from the photo in Paul's office. The consequences were far worse than any scandal could have been. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Paul would bring old family photos or documents, attempting to share pieces of their heritage. Sophie would counter with pointed questions about the past, while Thomas absorbed everything silently, his sketchbook filling with images that bridged the gaps in their family history. Mrs. Martinez observed these meetings with cautious optimism, noting how Paul never pushed when Sophie retreated into defensive silence, how he took genuine interest in Thomas's artwork, how he listened more than he spoke. But she also saw the internal struggle in Sophie, the way she fought against her own curiosity, her desire to know more about her father's family. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during their fifth meeting. Paul had brought a music box that had belonged to their grandmother. She used to play this for Robert when he was small, he explained, winding the delicate mechanism. As the familiar melody of Moon River filled the office, Thomas suddenly spoke. "Mum used to hum this to us," he said quietly, "every night before bed." Paul's hands trembled on the music box. "Margaret, your grandmother must have sung it to Kelly too," he realized aloud. "They were closer than I knew." Sophie's carefully maintained wall cracked slightly. "Tell us about her," she demanded, then added more softly, "please." For the first time, the conversation flowed naturally as Paul shared stories of Margaret Durant's kindness, her love of music, her secret support of KLA even after Robert left. Sophie remained guarded, but her questions became less accusatory, more searching. Thomas drew as Paul spoke, creating a visual history of the grandmother they'd never known. Yet beneath this progress lay deeper currents of unresolved pain. Paul still hadn't addressed Robert's disappearance, and Sophie hadn't forgiven the years of abandonment. The trust being built was as fragile as the antique music box, its melody both a bridge and a reminder of all they'd lost. The evolving relationship between Paul Durant and his grandchildren manifested in unexpected ways as autumn deepened into winter. At Harrison House, Paul's regular visits became part of the weekly routine, but the emotional landscape remained treacherous, marked by moments of connection and sudden retreats. During one particularly charged meeting, Paul brought a collection of Robert's childhood belongings, report cards, science fair ribbons, and a battered notebook filled with teenage poetry. Sophie initially refused to touch them, but her eyes followed every item Paul removed from the box. When Thomas discovered a sketch of a young Robert's dream house, remarkably similar to his own architectural drawings, the parallel struck a chord that even Sophie couldn't ignore. He was different then, Paul explained, handling each item with reverence. Before the weight of expectations, before my mistakes changed him, he paused at a family photo taken at Robert's 10th birthday. "I see him in both of you, Sophie's determination, Thomas's artistic soul." Sophie's response was cutting. "You lost the right to see anything in us when you chose your reputation over your son's happiness." Yet even as she spoke, her hand drifted to the poetry notebook, fingers tracing her father's adolescent handwriting. The dynamic shifted further when Paul suffered a minor heart scare. He missed a scheduled visit, and Thomas, to everyone's surprise, was the one who became agitated. What if something happened to him? He worried, pacing their room. "What if we lose another chance at family?" Sophie's dismissive response lacked her usual conviction. Their next meeting took place in the hospital against doctor's orders. Paul insisted on keeping their appointment, appearing older and more vulnerable in his hospital gown. For the first time, Sophie saw past the powerful businessman to the aging grandfather who was trying, however imperfectly, to rebuild what he had broken. "You should be resting," she said gruffly, adjusting his pillows with unconscious care. "Some things are more important than rest," Paul replied, watching her actions with quiet hope. Thomas had brought anew, drawing a portrait of Paul in his hospital bed, but transformed into a scene from Robert's childhood, where a younger Paul reads stories to his son. The image captured both reality and possibility, what was and what could have been. Paul's eyes misted as he studied it. "You have your father's gift for seeing beneath the surface," he told Thomas, then turned to Sophie, "and his courage to stand up for what you believe in, even against me." The moment hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Sophie's usual defenses wavered as she recognized the genuine admiration in Paul's voice. "Thomas." ever sensitive to emotional undercurrents, began a new sketch capturing this subtle shift in their family's dynamics. Yet beneath these growing connections lay the unspoken question of Robert's absence. Each small step toward trust was shadowed by the larger betrayal that had shaped their lives. Paul knew that true healing couldn't begin until they addressed this central wound, but he feared the truth might shatter the delicate bridges being built. The truth emerged through an innocent discovery in Paul Durant's private study. During one of their now regular visits to Durant Manor, Thomas had wandered into the book-lined room while Paul was taking a business call. Sophie, following to keep an eye on her brother, found him transfixed before an old photograph hung in a shadowed corner. The image showed a much younger Paul Durant standing beside a familiar figure, their mother, Kiele, as a teenager. They were at what appeared to be a scholarship ceremony, Paul presenting her with an award, both smiling broadly at the camera. "What is this?" Sophie demanded when Paul entered the room. Her voice trembled with suppressed emotion. "You knew her before? You knew her as a girl?" Paul sank heavily into his leather chair, the weight of long-buried memories evident in his bearing. Kiele was one of the first recipients of the Durant Educational Foundation scholarship, he admitted. She was brilliant, top of her class, exceptional writing talent. I mentored her personally for 3 years. Thomas, still studying the photograph, noticed something else. "There are more pictures," he said softly, pointing to a row of framed photographs partially hidden behind books. Each showed Kiele's progression through high school and into college, always with Paul Durant presenting awards or attending academic events. "You watched her grow up," Sophie realized, her voice hardening. "You knew exactly who she was when Robert fell in love with her. It wasn't about her background at all, was it? What really happened?" Paul's hands gripped his armrests, knuckles whitening. "I thought I was protecting everyone," he said. "Kiele was like a daughter to me. When she and Robert began dating, I convinced myself it was inappropriate, that she'd betrayed my trust, that Robert was being rebellious." "You turned on her," Sophie interrupted, the pieces falling into place. "Your own protégé. You threatened to expose something about her family, didn't you? That's what the letters meant." The silence that followed was deafening. Paul's eyes filled with tears as he nodded slowly. "Her father was in prison," he admitted. "I'd helped keep it quiet to protect her scholarship. I threatened to make it public, to ruin her chances at graduate school. I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping them apart." Thomas had gone very still, his artist's sensitivity picking up the layers of tragedy in this revelation. "But they loved each other anyway," he said quietly. "They did," Paul agreed, his voice breaking. "And in trying to prevent what I saw as a scandal, I created a far greater tragedy. I drove away my son, betrayed a girl I'd helped raise, and denied my own grandchildren their birthright." Sophie stood by the window, her reflection overlaying the nighttime darkness. "You didn't just deny us our father," she said. "You denied our mother the support of the man who'd been like a father to her. When she needed you most, you abandoned her too." The weight of this new betrayal hung in the air, threatening to destroy the fragile bonds they'd begun to build. Sophie's confrontation with Paul erupted the following day in his office at Durant Tower. She had requested a private meeting, arriving with a manila folder containing every article, photograph and letter she'd collected over the months. "You played God with our lives," she began, her voice controlled but vibrating with anger. "You weren't just a disapproving father or a prejudiced businessman. You were the architect of our entire tragedy." Paul sat behind his mahogany desk, looking older than she'd ever seen him. "Sophie, I've admitted my mistakes." "Mistakes?" She slapped the folder down, photographs spilling across his desk. "You mentored our mother for years. You knew her struggles, her dreams, her potential. She trusted you. And then you used that trust, used her deepest vulnerabilities against her." Sophie picked up one photograph, Kiele receiving the Durant Scholar of the Year award, Paul's hand on her shoulder, both beaming at the camera. "Did you feel anything when you threatened her? When you promised to destroy everything she'd worked for?" "I felt fear," Paul admitted quietly. "Fear of scandal, fear of losing control, fear of my son making what I thought was a terrible mistake. Fear makes us cruel, Sophie." Fear. Sophie's laugh was bitter. Mom lived with real fear. Fear of not making rent. Fear of her children going hungry. Fear of her past being exposed. But she never let that fear make her cruel. She paced the office, gesturing at the wealth surrounding them. All this power, all these resources. You could have helped her after Robert left. You could have ensured we had enough to eat, that Mum didn't have to work 3 jobs. Instead, you watched from a distance as she struggled. Paul stood, moving to interrupt, but Sophie held up her hand. I'm not finished. You talk about redemption, about making things right, but how do you make right years of deliberate cruelty? How do you compensate for a mother working herself to exhaustion? For birthdays spent alone? For the look in Mom's eyes every time we asked about our father? Her voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. You didn't just separate 2 young lovers. You didn't just punish your son's defiance. You condemned 2 innocent children to a life of poverty and uncertainty. You forced a dedicated mother to carry burdens alone that should have been shared by family. Paul's face was ashen. If I could change the past. But you can't, Sophie interrupted. You can't give us back our childhood. You can't give Mum back her life. You can't erase the nights Thomas cried himself to sleep, wondering why his father didn't want him. She gathered the photographs, her hands trembling. Your money can't fix this. Your influence can't make it right. The only thing you can give us now is the complete truth about everything. The silence that followed her words was absolute. Outside the office windows, New York continued its relentless pace, unaware of the emotional devastation occurring 50 stories above its streets. The weeks following Sophie's confrontation with Paul brought profound changes to the Durant family dynamic. The carefully constructed bridges between grandfather and grandchildren seemed to crumble, replaced by a raw honesty that was both painful and necessary. At Harrison House, Thomas retreated into his art with renewed intensity. His drawings took on a darker edge. Portraits of Paul now showed the weight of guilt in his features, while sketches of their mother emphasized her solitude, her quiet strength in adversity. When Ms. Harrison inquired about the change in his work, Thomas merely shook his head, unable to verbalize the complexity of his emotions. Paul's response to the confrontation manifested in unexpected ways. He began the painstaking process of documenting everything, every decision, every action, every consequence of his choices over the years. His office filled with timelines, correspondence, and financial records, all meticulously organized for Sophie and Thomas to examine. He's trying to punish himself, Mrs. Martinez observed to Ms. Harrison, watching Paul's stooped figure leaving the building one evening. But perhaps that's necessary for real healing to begin. Sophie, having unleashed years of repressed anger, found herself in unfamiliar emotional territory. The satisfaction of confronting Paul was overshadowed by a deeper pain, the realization that their family's tragedy had been orchestrated, not by fate, but by conscious choices. During their mandatory weekly meetings, now supervised by a family therapist, the atmosphere shifted from cautious optimism to profound discomfort. Paul answered every question with brutal honesty, no matter how difficult. He revealed how he'd tracked Claire's struggles over the years, how his pride had prevented him from helping, how he'd justified his actions through a lens of protecting the Durant legacy. I don't expect forgiveness, he told them during one particularly intense session. But you deserve to understand how thoroughly I failed, not just as a grandfather, but as a human being. Thomas, usually the family peacemaker, surprised everyone by responding, understanding why someone hurt us doesn't make the pain less real. The impact rippled beyond their immediate circle. Ms. Harrison noticed other children at the home watching the Durant drama unfold, learning their own lessons about family, forgiveness, and the complexity of adult relationships. Mrs. Martinez found herself mediating increasingly complicated conversations about moral choices and their consequences. Yet amid this emotional turbulence, something unexpected emerged, a foundation of truth, however painful, upon which a more authentic relationship might eventually be built. The practiced politeness of their earlier interactions gave way to something more genuine, if more difficult to navigate. As autumn turned to winter, the Durant family found themselves in uncharted territory, where the truth had been spoken but its consequences remained to be seen. The question now wasn't whether they could return to their previous careful dance, but whether they could forge something new from the ashes of revealed secrets. The letter from Child Protective Services arrived on an unseasonably cold November morning at Harrison House. Ms. Harrison's hands trembled as she read its contents. A review had determined that the twins should be placed in separate foster homes to facilitate better individual adjustment and integration. "This is ridiculous," Mrs. Martinez exclaimed, reading over her supervisor's shoulder. "They've never been apart. It would destroy them," but both women recognized the bureaucratic finality in the document's language, with its 2-week notice and formal requirements for transition. The news reached Paul Durant through his network of contacts before Harrison House could officially inform him. His immediate response was swift. A team of lawyers descended upon his office, while private investigators began examining the circumstances behind this sudden decision. Sophie and Thomas received the news in MS. Harrison's office, their reactions highlighting their fundamental differences. Sophie's face hardened into a mask of determination, her hands clenching into fists. "They can't separate us. We won't let them." Thomas, by contrast, went completely still, his artist's hands clutching his ever-present sketchbook like a shield. "The system believes that twins sometimes develop codependent relationships that hinder their individual growth," the social worker explained, her rehearsed words falling flat in the face of the twins' evident distress. "We've identified excellent foster families for both of you." "No," Sophie's voice cut through the explanation like a blade. "Thomas is all I have left of our family. He's all I have left of Mom." Her voice caught on the last word, but she pressed on. "You can't do this to us." The social worker's expression softened slightly. "I understand this is difficult, but studies show that siblings, especially twins, often thrive when given space to develop independently. The foster families we've selected are both excellent and only 30 minutes apart." 30 minutes might as well be 30 miles, Thomas spoke up suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't understand. Sophie and I, we're not just siblings. We're two halves of the same story." He opened his sketchbook, showing a series of drawings, paired images of their life together, each incomplete without its companion piece. The crisis catalyzed a change in Paul Durant. Watching his grandchildren face another devastating loss, he felt something shift inside him, a fierce protective instinct he hadn't experienced since Robert was young. He immediately filed for emergency guardianship, leveraging every connection and resource at his disposal. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had once torn a family apart was now fighting desperately to keep one together. His lawyers worked around the clock, challenging the separation order on multiple grounds, while Paul himself reached out to every contact he had in family services and the judicial system. At Harrison House, the countdown to separation created an atmosphere of quiet desperation. Sophie and Thomas spent every possible moment together, as if trying to store up memories against the approaching darkness. Thomas filled page after page with portraits of his sister, while Sophie memorized every detail of their shared routines, their private jokes, their silent understanding. Mrs. Martinez found them late one night, huddled together in the study room, poring over a map. "We could run away," Sophie was saying, her finger tracing possible routes. "Find somewhere they can't separate us." The elderly caretaker's heart broke at the determination in their voices, the desperate plans they were making. The situation reached a critical point when Paul discovered the real motivation behind the separation order. A competing business rival seeking leverage against him had influenced the decision through carefully placed donations and suggestions. The revelation sent him into a cold fury once again. Adult power plays were threatening to destroy innocent lives. As the deadline approached, the Durant family faced its greatest test yet. The question wasn't just about keeping the twins together, it was about breaking a cycle of family separation that had haunted them for generations. For Paul, it became a chance to atone for his past sins. For Sophie and Thomas, it was a fight for survival itself. The Durant family's legal battle unfolded in the austere chambers of the New York family court. Paul Durant sat ramrod straight beside his legal team, watching as his past actions were dissected and examined in excruciating detail. Every decision he'd made regarding Robert and Kelly now faced scrutiny, as the court assessed his fitness as a guardian. "Mr. Durant," the opposing counsel began, her voice precise and cutting, "can you explain why, if you care so deeply for these children, you made no attempt to contact them for 12 years? Why, despite your considerable resources, you allowed their mother to struggle financially?" Paul's response revealed a changed man. "I have no excuse for my past behavior," he stated, his voice steady despite his obvious emotion. "I can only demonstrate through my actions now that I've learned from those grievous mistakes. These children deserve to stay together, and I have the means and the desire to ensure they thrive." The courtroom proceedings brought unexpected allies. Mrs. Martinez testified about the twins' extraordinary bond, presenting Thomas's paired artwork as evidence of their unique connection. Ms. Harrison provided detailed reports showing how the siblings supported each other's development rather than hindering it. Most surprisingly, letters began arriving from prominent child psychologists and family therapists across the country, challenging the psychological basis for separating the twins. These experts, many of whom had no connection to the Durant family, argued that forced separation could cause profound trauma, especially given their recent loss. The turning point came when evidence emerged about the business rivals' manipulation of the separation order. Paul's investigators uncovered a trail of strategic donations and carefully placed phone calls that had influenced the initial decision. The revelation shifted the court's focus from Paul's fitness as a guardian to the corruption that had threatened the twins' well-being. Sophie and Thomas attended each hearing, their presence a silent reminder of what was at stake. Sophie maintained her protective stance, while Thomas documented the proceedings in his sketchbook, creating a visual record of their fight to stay together. Their unity, evident in every shared glance and subtle gesture, spoke more eloquently than any legal argument. During one crucial session, the judge asked the twins directly about their preferences. Sophie stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Our mother taught us that family means standing together, especially in hard times. Thomas and I are not just siblings who happen to live together. We're partners in surviving loss, in keeping our mother's memory alive, in facing whatever comes next." Thomas added quietly, "Every drawing I make has two perspectives, what I see and what Sophie sees. That's how we understand the world, together." The legal battle took an unexpected turn when Paul made a dramatic decision. He announced his intention to step down as CEO of Durant Industries, designating the majority of his time to focusing on his grandchildren's welfare. The move demonstrated a level of commitment that even his harshest critics couldn't dismiss. "My life's work isn't my company," he told the court. "It's making amends to my family. These children deserve not just financial security, but the full attention and dedication of someone who understands the cost of putting business before family." As the case progressed, a broader narrative emerged, one of redemption, of breaking cycles of family separation, of choosing connection over convenience. The courtroom became a stage for examining not just legal guardianship, but the very nature of family bonds and the possibility of second chances. The legal team worked tirelessly, building a case that went beyond mere financial capability to demonstrate a deep understanding of the twins' emotional and psychological needs. Each day brought new challenges, but also new evidence of Paul's transformation from a distant figure of authority to a grandfather fighting for his family's unity. In the midst of the custody battle, Robert Durant had been secretly monitoring every development through his own network of contacts. Teaching under an assumed name at a public school in Brooklyn, he gathered newspaper clippings about the case and followed the court proceedings from a distance, his internal struggle growing with each passing day. One evening, an unmarked envelope arrived at Paul Durant's office. Inside was a comprehensive dossier detailing the business rival's corruption, along with sworn affidavits from key witnesses. The package bore no return address, but Paul recognized his son's methodical research style. Robert had always been thorough in building a case. The next piece of evidence arrived at the courthouse, anonymously records of every anonymous donation Robert had managed to channel to KLA over the years, traced through a complex network of accounts. The documentation proved that while he had physically abandoned his family, he had attempted to provide financial support, though his own limited means meant the help was minimal compared to what the Durant fortune could have provided. During a crucial hearing, a new witness appeared, Dr. James Mitchell, Robert's former therapist. With Robert's written permission, he testified about the psychological impact of Paul's ultimatum and the years of depression that followed. The testimony painted a picture not of a callous deserter, but of a broken young man who believed his presence would only bring more harm to those he loved. Sophie, sharp as ever, began noticing patterns in the new evidence. "These records," she whispered to Thomas during one session, "they're too detailed, too personal. Someone close to Mom must have helped compile them." Thomas said nothing, but his latest sketches began incorporating a shadowy figure watching from the periphery of family scenes. The turning point came through an unexpected channel. Mrs. Martinez received a letter at Harrison House, addressed to the twins. Inside was a USB drive containing years of surveillance photos Sophie and Thomas at school events, holidays, ordinary moments. Along with the photos was a simple note in familiar handwriting: "I watched over you as best I could, even if I lacked the courage to do more." Paul recognized the impact of Robert's invisible support. In his next court appearance, he addressed it directly: "My son, despite my actions driving him away, never completely abandoned his children. He did what he could from the shadows, while I, with all my resources, did nothing. The failure was mine, not his." The revelation of Robert's ongoing, if distant, involvement added another layer to the custody battle. It demonstrated a complex web of family ties that went beyond physical presence or financial support. The court began to understand that the Durant family's story wasn't simply one of abandonment and redemption, but of love expressing itself even through separation and pain. Sophie struggled with this new information, her anger at Robert now complicated by evidence of his attempted involvement. Thomas, however, found validation in it. His artistic intuition had always sensed a watching presence, something he'd tried to capture in his drawings but could never quite explain. As the legal proceedings continued, Robert's invisible hand continued to guide events. More evidence emerged, more witnesses appeared, all carefully orchestrated from behind the scenes. He was building a case not just for keeping the twins together, but for preserving the possibility of future reconciliation. The court began to see the full picture: 3 generations of Durants, each wounded by pride and fear, yet bound together by an indestructible connection. The twins' fate rested not just on Paul's redemption, but on the hidden acts of love that had sustained them even in their darkest moments. The strain of the custody battle finally took its toll during a crucial court session. Paul Durant was presenting his final testimony when his words suddenly slurred and he gripped the witness stand for support. The courtroom erupted in chaos as he collapsed, his face ashen, his breathing labored. Sophie and Thomas watched in horror as paramedics rushed their grandfather to Mount Sinai Hospital. Despite their complicated feelings toward him, the sight of Paul's vulnerability shook them deeply. Thomas clutched his sketchbook, mechanically drawing the scene as if to make sense of it, while Sophie stood rigid, her usual protective instincts conflicting with her lingering anger. The diagnosis was severe stress-induced cardiac episode, requiring immediate surgery. As Paul was rushed into the operating room, his legal team huddled with Harrison House staff, discussing contingency plans. The timing couldn't have been worse. The custody decision was pending, and Paul's incapacitation threatened to undermine everything they'd fought for. But in the hospital waiting room, Sophie paced restlessly. "This doesn't change anything," she insisted to Thomas, but her voice lacked conviction. "We can't let his health problems manipulate us into forgetting what he did." Thomas looked up from his sketchbook, where he'd been drawing Paul's face as it had appeared in court, not the powerful businessman, but a tired old man trying to make amends. "What if holding on to anger is as destructive as what he did to Mom and Dad?" he asked quietly. The surgery lasted 6 hours. During that time, something shifted in the twins' perspective. They observed the hospital staff's reactions to the Durant name not with the usual deference to wealth, but with genuine respect. They learned that Paul had been a major donor to the children's wing, funding cutting-edge treatments for families who couldn't afford them. More surprisingly, nurses approached them with personal stories. "Your grandfather funded my nursing scholarship," one confided. "He's been quietly supporting medical education for years." Another spoke of a program Paul had established for children of single parents, inspired, they now realized, by their mother's struggles. When the surgeon finally emerged, his news was cautiously optimistic. The surgery had been successful, but Paul's recovery would require significant lifestyle changes and constant care. The unspoken question hung in the air: who would provide that care? In Paul's private room, machines beeped steadily as he lay unconscious, looking smaller and more fragile than they'd ever seen him. Sophie approached the bed hesitantly, touching his hand for the first time since their confrontation. Thomas sat in the corner, sketching the scene with tears in his eyes, the mighty Durant patriarch reduced to this, their anger suddenly seeming small against the reality of mortality. The crisis forced both children to confront complex truths about forgiveness, family, and the price of holding on to resentment. As they kept vigil by Paul's bedside, the custody battle that had consumed them all seemed to shift into a different perspective, revealing deeper questions about what truly makes a family. With Paul incapacitated and the custody case in jeopardy, Child Services presented Sophie with an impossible choice. The department offered to place Thomas with a prestigious foster family in Manhattan, one with connections to the art world, who could nurture his talent if Sophie agreed to separate placement. "Your brother has extraordinary artistic potential," the social worker explained in a private meeting. "The Lawrences have connections with several art schools, and their previous foster children have all received scholarships, but they can only take one child." Sophie sat in Ms. Harrison's office, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She thought of Thomas's growing portfolio, his dreams of art school, the way his talent had sustained them through their darkest days. The Lawrences could offer him opportunities that even Paul's wealth couldn't guarantee: legitimate connections in the art world, mentorship, a path to his dreams. That evening, Sophie watched Thomas sketching by Paul's hospital bedside. His drawings had taken on a new dimension during their grandfather's illness, capturing not just images but emotions: Paul's vulnerability, the family's tension, the shadow of uncertainty over their future. She recognized with painful clarity that his art wasn't just a hobby, it was his voice, his way of processing the world. Making her decision, Sophie requested a meeting with the social worker and Ms. Harrison. "I'll agree to separate placement," she stated, her voice steady despite her breaking heart. "But I have conditions. Thomas isn't to know I had a choice. Let him believe it was the department's decision. And I want weekly visits, not monthly." "Ms. Harrison protested. "Sophie, you don't have to sacrifice your relationship with your brother. We can fight this," but Sophie shook her head, years of protecting Thomas crystallizing into this final act of love. "Mom always said our talents were gifts to be nurtured," Sophie explained, fighting back tears. "Thomas has a gift that could change his life. I won't be the one to hold him back." The paperwork was drawn up discreetly. Sophie threw herself into researching the Lawrences, ensuring they were everything the social worker claimed. She documented Thomas's medication schedule, his favorite foods, the warning signs of his anxiety attacks, creating a manual for his new foster parents. The night before the scheduled separation, Sophie sat on Thomas's bed, watching him sleep. She memorized every detail of his face, knowing that their daily rituals of shared meals and whispered conversations would soon end. In her hand, she clutched a letter she'd written explaining her decision, to be delivered years later when Thomas was old enough to understand. "I promise I'll find a way back to you," she whispered, touching his hair gently. "But first you need to become who you're meant to be." In Paul's hospital room the next morning, monitors beeped steadily as Sophie prepared to tell her brother about the department's decision. She squared her shoulders, drawing on every ounce of strength their mother had taught her, ready to break her own heart to protect his dreams. News of Paul Durant's hospitalization and the twins' predicament spread quickly through their interconnected New York communities, catalyzing an unexpected wave of support that crossed social and economic boundaries. Mrs. Martinez mobilized the Harrison House network first, coordinating with former residents who had aged out of the system. These young adults, many of whom remembered KLA's kindness during her volunteer work, organized a rotating schedule to support the twins. They accompanied Thomas to art classes and helped Sophie maintain her academic commitments while juggling hospital visits. The hospital staff, touched by the family's struggle, made unprecedented accommodations. Dr. Sarah Chen, the cardiac unit's head, arranged for the twins to use an empty office for homework between visits. Nurses quietly extended visiting hours, pretending not to notice when Sophie fell asleep in the waiting room after late-night study sessions. At the twins' school, teachers rallied in their own way. Mr. Peterson, Thomas's art teacher, started coming in early to provide private instruction, helping Thomas prepare a portfolio that could challenge the Lawrences' connections. Ms. Rodriguez, Sophie's English teacher, stayed late to help her craft arguments for the legal proceedings, drawing on her previous experience as a paralegal. Even Paul's business rivals showed unexpected humanity. James Morrison, CEO of a competing firm and a father of twins himself, publicly withdrew his company's opposition to Paul's guardianship petition. "Some battles," he announced to the press, "matter more than business." The most touching support came from unexpected quarters. the elderly Mr. Chen from the local grocery store appeared at the hospital with home-cooked meals, explaining that Kiale had once helped his daughter apply for college. Ms. Watson, the librarian who had given the twins sanctuary during difficult days, organized a letter-writing campaign to the family court judge. Local artists, hearing of Thomas's talent and the threat of separation, arranged a spontaneous exhibition of his work in a small gallery. The show, titled Family Bonds, featured his sketches of Paul in the hospital, Sophie's protective vigilance, and their mother's memory. The proceeds were dedicated to a legal fund for families fighting separation. Sophie, witnessing this outpouring of support, began to understand something her mother had always tried to teach them: family extended beyond blood. Each act of kindness, each person standing up for their unity, wove a stronger net of protection around them. The community's response caught the attention of local media. The story of the Durant twins became a rallying point for discussions about family courts, foster care reform, and the importance of keeping siblings together. Letters flooded the courthouse, not from Paul's lawyers or business connections, but from ordinary people sharing their own stories of sibling separation and reunification. In his hospital room, Paul watched this groundswell of support with tears in his eyes. The community he had viewed primarily as a market was revealing its heart, teaching him about wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars. The discovery that changed everything happened during the hospital renovation. As construction crews cleared Paul's old office to create a children's waiting area, a worker found a hidden compartment behind the mahogany paneling. Inside lay a leather-bound diary, its pages brittle with age, bearing Kia's distinctive handwriting. Sophie was the first to receive the call from the hospital administrator. "Ms. Durant, we found something that belonged to your mother." Her hands trembled as she held the diary, recognizing the monogrammed cover she'd seen her mother writing in countless times. The first entry was dated 12 years ago, the day after Robert's disappearance. "My dearest children." It began, "I'm writing this in Paul's office, though he doesn't know I'm here. Your father left today believing he's protecting us. There's so much you need to understand about why things happened as they did." As Sophie read further, a more complex narrative emerged. Kiale had been secretly meeting with Paul even after Robert's departure, trying to bridge the divide between father and son. The diary revealed regular encounters in this very office, where Paul would ask about Robert's whereabouts while Kiale sought his help in bringing his son home. Paul is not the monster Robert believes him to be. One entry read, "Nor is he the perfect father he pretends to be. He's a man trapped by his own fears, just as your father is trapped by his pride. Both of them love too deeply to know how to love well." Thomas, reading over Sophie's shoulder, stopped at a particular passage today. "Paul held the ultrasound picture of you both. For a moment I saw the grandfather he could be, not the businessman he thinks he must be. He keeps the photo in his desk drawer, though he thinks I don't know." The diary painted a portrait of three people caught in an impossible situation: Kiale trying to protect her unborn children, Robert believing his absence would shield them from his father's influence, and Paul realizing too late the cost of his actions. Most revealing were Kiale's final entries, written just weeks before her accident. "My darling Sophie and Thomas, if you're reading this, know that both your father and grandfather are better men than their choices suggest. Paul has watched over you from afar, his guilt preventing him from reaching out. Robert has never stopped loving you, his shame keeping him in shadows. The tragedy of the Durants is not in their lack of love, but in their fear of showing it." In his hospital bed, Paul listened as Sophie read these passages aloud, each word a testimony to opportunities lost and damages done. The diary offered no easy absolution, but it provided something perhaps more valuable: context, understanding, and a bridge across years of misunderstanding. As Paul recovered in the hospital, Kiale's diary revealed the full truth about Robert's disappearance. The entries painted a complex picture of the days following his departure, filled with details that neither Sophie nor Thomas had known. According to the diary, Robert hadn't simply abandoned them. The night he left, he had received an anonymous threat: photographs of Kiale with her father in prison, documentation of her family's troubled past, and a clear message that this information would destroy her career and future unless he disappeared. The threat, Kiale wrote, hadn't come from Paul as Robert had assumed, but from someone else within the Durant empire who saw their relationship as a liability. Robert made his choice that night. Kiale had written, believing he was protecting our future. He didn't know I was already pregnant. When I tried to tell him, the messages became more threatening, now including details about my father's criminal connections. Someone was determined to keep us apart, using my past as a weapon. The diary revealed that Robert had conducted his own investigation from afar, eventually discovering that Howard Bennett, Paul's most trusted advisor, had orchestrated the threats. Bennett had seen the relationship as a threat to the company's reputation and had acted without Paul's knowledge, believing he was protecting the Durant legacy. Paul, reading these revelations from his hospital bed, looked stricken. "Bennett," he whispered. "He was like a brother to me. All these years his voice trailed off as the implications settled in. His own trusted advisor had destroyed his family, while he had blamed his son." The truth hit Sophie and Thomas differently. For Sophie, it complicated her carefully constructed anger. The villain in her story wasn't who she'd thought, not her father, not even her grandfather, but a man she'd never met, acting out of misguided loyalty. Thomas found validation in these revelations. His drawings of their father, always showing him in shadows but never in darkness, had captured an essential truth. Robert had been present in absence, protecting them in the only way he believed he could. Kiai's final entries revealed one last twist. She had discovered Bennett's involvement shortly before her accident. Her last appointment, the day she crashed, had been with a private investigator who had compiled evidence of Bennett's actions. The folder of evidence had vanished from her car after the crash. Paul, upon learning this, pressed the emergency call button. When his lawyer arrived, he issued immediate orders to find Howard Bennett. The man had retired years ago to a quiet life in Connecticut, but his comfortable retirement was about to end. The diary's revelations set in motion a cascade of events that would finally bring the full truth to light. For the first time, all the pieces of their family tragedy aligned, revealing not a simple story of abandonment, but a complex web of loyalty, betrayal and misunderstanding that had torn 3 generations apart. The final piece of the puzzle emerged when Paul, strengthened by his recovery, decided to reveal his own complete role in the family's tragedy. In his hospital room, with Sophie and Thomas present, he shared a story that had haunted him for 12 years. "I knew about Bennett's threats," Paul confessed, his voice steady despite his evident shame. "Not immediately, but soon after Robert left. I discovered the photos, the letters, the surveillance reports. But instead of stopping it, I convinced myself it was for the best. I told myself that if Robert and Kelly separated naturally, believing it was their own choice, they would eventually move on." Sophie's sharp intake of breath cut through the room's silence. Paul continued, each word weighted with regret. "I didn't authorize Bennett's actions, but I permitted them through my silence. When I learned Kelly was pregnant, I was too proud, too committed to my mistake to admit my role. Instead, I watched from afar, arranging anonymous financial support that could never compensate for the damage I'd allowed." Thomas, who had been sketching throughout the confession, looked up from his paper. His drawing captured Paul's expression with devastating accuracy, a man finally unburdened of secrets, but crushed by their weight. "You could have stopped it at any time," he said quietly. "Yes," Paul acknowledged. "Every year, every Christmas, every birthday, I told myself it was too late to fix what I'd broken. I watched Kiale struggle, watched you both grow up from a distance, and convinced myself that revealing the truth would only cause more pain." The revelation of Paul's complicity through inaction cast every previous interaction in a new light. His recent efforts at redemption, his fight for custody, his willingness to sacrifice his company, all were attempts to atone for not just one moment of pride, but years of calculated silence. "When your mother died," Paul continued, his voice breaking, "I realized that my silence had cost not just my son's love, but potentially my grandchildren's lives. The accident that took her happened because she was working 3 jobs she wouldn't have needed if I'd had the courage to act." Sophie, who had remained silent throughout the confession, finally spoke. "All those years of watching us, you were carrying this guilt. Is that why you never approached us directly? Why you waited for us to find you?" Paul nodded, tears falling freely now. "Every time I saw you at school events, at the park, in the city, I wanted to approach you. But how do you tell children that you chose your pride over their happiness, that you watched their mother struggle when you could have helped, that you let another man destroy your family because admitting the truth was too painful?" The room fell into silence, broken only by the steady beep of medical monitors and the soft scratch of Thomas's pencil against paper. This final truth, perhaps the hardest to hear, completed their understanding of the past. The question now was whether this complete honesty could form the foundation for a different future. The healing process began in an unlikely place, the family therapy room at Mount Sinai Hospital. With Paul still recovering from surgery, the hospital's psychological support team suggested joint counseling sessions, creating a neutral space where 3 generations of Durants could begin to rebuild. Dr. Rachel Anderson, a specialist in family trauma, guided their initial sessions with careful precision. The first meeting established ground rules that would shape their journey: absolute honesty, no matter how painful, respect for each person's emotional boundaries, and acknowledgement that healing would not follow a linear path. "Each of you carries different wounds," Dr. Anderson explained, observing the family's careful positioning in the room: Paul in his wheelchair, Sophie maintaining physical distance, Thomas sketching in the corner. "Our goal isn't to erase the past, but to understand how it shapes our present choices and future possibilities." The breakthrough came during their third session, when Paul, still weakened from his surgery, asked to address Sophie and Thomas directly. "I've spent my life building skyscrapers," he began, his voice trembling with emotion, "monuments to success that everyone could see. But I failed to build the only thing that truly mattered: a foundation of trust with my family." Sophie, who had maintained her protective shell throughout previous sessions, found herself responding to her grandfather's vulnerability. "I keep thinking about Mom," she admitted. "How even after everything, she kept your photo on her dresser. She believed in the possibility of reconciliation until the end." Thomas shared his latest series of drawings, a visual journey through their family's history. Each image captured pivotal moments: Robert and Kayleigh's young love, Paul's solitary vigils watching his grandchildren from afar, the current hospital room where 3 generations were attempting to bridge years of silence. The artwork provided a language for emotions too complex for words. Dr. Anderson introduced an exercise that became central to their healing process. Each family member would share one truth and one hope at the beginning of each session. The truths often hurt: Sophie's admission of her fear of abandonment, Thomas's confession of his secret attempts to find Robert, Paul's acknowledgement of how his pride had poisoned his relationships. But the hopes began to outweigh the hurts. Paul spoke of his desire to create a foundation in Kayleigh's name, supporting single parents through education and career development. Sophie revealed her interest in studying law, inspired by their family's journey through the legal system. Thomas shared his dream of documenting their story through his art, turning pain into beauty. The hospital staff noticed subtle changes in the family's dynamics. Paul began asking Sophie's opinion on business decisions, recognizing her sharp analytical mind. Thomas started bringing his sketchbook to Paul's physical therapy sessions, documenting his grandfather's determination to regain strength. The distance between them gradually decreased, physically and emotionally. Most significantly, they began discussing Robert not as an absence to be mourned or a betrayal to be resented, but as a missing piece they could work together to understand and perhaps eventually recover. Paul shared stories of Robert's childhood, helping the twins understand the father they'd never known. In return, they shared memories of Kayleigh, allowing Paul to know the remarkable woman she'd become in the years after Robert's departure. The healing wasn't smooth or simple. There were sessions filled with tears, with anger, with the reopening of old wounds, but beneath the pain, a foundation of understanding began to form. They learned to recognize patterns of behavior, to challenge assumptions, to express needs that had gone unspoken for years. Dr. Anderson observed that their progress, though significant, was just the beginning. Real healing, she reminded them, happens in the small moments between sessions in. The practical work of rebuilding trust began as Paul transitioned from hospital to home care. Against his initial protests, the twins moved into Durant Manor to help with his recovery, transforming the austere mansion into a space of gradual healing and tentative connection. Each morning established a new routine. Sophie, early riser like her grandfather, would join Paul in his study to review medical instructions and medication schedules. These practical discussions slowly evolved into deeper conversations about business ethics, family responsibility, and the legacy they wanted to build. Paul found himself impressed by Sophie's incisive questions and unflinching moral clarity, recognizing in her the strength that had drawn him to mentor Kayleigh years ago. Thomas took charge of Paul's physical therapy space, converting a formal sitting room into a rehabilitation area. He filled the walls with his artwork, creating a visual timeline of their family's journey. Paul would exercise while Thomas sketched, their silence comfortable rather than strained. Sometimes Paul would pause between exercises to share stories about Robert's artistic talents as a child, helping Thomas understand this inherited gift. The family established weekly rituals that became cornerstones of their developing relationship. Sunday dinners, once formal affairs designed to impress business associates, transformed into casual gatherings where they cooked together in the manor's expansive kitchen. Paul learned his grandchildren's favorite foods, while Sophie and Thomas discovered their grandfather's surprisingly adventurous palate. Trust built in unexpected moments. When Paul suffered a minor setback in his recovery, Sophie stayed up all night monitoring his condition, her vigilance reminiscent of Kiale's dedication. The next morning, Paul found her asleep in the chair beside his bed, one hand still resting on his wrist to check his pulse. It was the first time she had allowed herself to be vulnerable in his presence. Thomas's contribution to their healing came through art therapy sessions he organized. Using techniques learned from his own counseling, he guided Paul and Sophie through exercises in creative expression. Paul's awkward attempts at drawing brought genuine laughter to their interactions, while Sophie discovered that art could express emotions she struggled to verbalize. The most significant breakthrough came when Paul handed over control of the Durant Educational Foundation to Sophie's oversight. "Your mother understood what education could mean to someone with limited opportunities," he explained. "I think she'd want you to help shape other young lives the way she shaped yours." This trust in Sophie's judgment extended beyond the foundation. Paul began including both twins in discussions about Durant Industries' charitable initiatives, valuing their perspective on how the company's resources could better serve the community. Their input led to new programs supporting arts education in public schools and legal aid for single-parent families. Yet challenges remained. Certain topics, particularly discussions about Robert, still caused tension. Paul struggled with his instinct to protect the twins from difficult truths, while Sophie battled her tendency to withdraw when conversations became emotionally challenging. Thomas often found himself mediating between their similar, stubborn personalities. The turning point in their trust-building process came during a crisis at Durant Industries. A rival company attempted a hostile takeover, using Paul's recent illness as leverage. Rather than retreating into his former pattern of solitary decision-making, Paul opened his office to his grandchildren, sharing both the company's vulnerabilities and his fears for its future. Together, they crafted a response that protected both the company and its employees, with Sophie's strategic thinking complementing Paul's experience, while Thomas's creative perspective offered innovative solutions. This collaboration marked a new phase in their relationship, one where trust wasn't just about healing the past, but about building a future together. The journey toward forgiveness reached its pivotal moment during the annual Durant Industries charity gala. Paul had insisted on attending, despite his still fragile health, and asked Sophie and Thomas to accompany him. The event, traditionally a showcase of corporate philanthropy, became an unexpected platform for public reconciliation. Standing at the podium, Paul deviated from his prepared speech. "For years I've stood here talking about corporate responsibility and community investment," he began, his voice steady despite his weakness. "But I failed to invest in what mattered most, my own family. Tonight, I want to announce a new direction for Durant Industries, one guided by the wisdom of the next generation." He gestured to Sophie and Thomas, inviting them to join him on stage. The audience, composed of New York's business elite, watched as Paul publicly acknowledged his grandchildren for the first time. "My greatest legacy isn't the buildings we've constructed or the wealth we've accumulated. It's the chance to make amends, to learn from those we've wronged, and to build something stronger than success, understanding." Sophie, who had prepared herself to remain stoic through the evening, found herself moved by her grandfather's vulnerability. In that moment she saw not the powerful businessman who had shaped their family's tragedy, but an elderly man seeking redemption. When Paul faltered slightly at the podium, she stepped forward instinctively to support him, a gesture captured by Thomas in a quick sketch. The evening marked a transition in their relationship. The formal boundaries between them began to dissolve, replaced by genuine affection. Paul started joining them for casual dinners in the kitchen, rather than insisting on formal dining room meals. Sophie began sharing her law school applications with him, valuing his insight rather than resenting his influence. Thomas filled the manor's halls with new artwork that captured their evolving relationship. The most profound moment of acceptance came unexpectedly. While helping Paul organize his office, Sophie discovered a box of letters correspondence between Paul and Kelly that had continued secretly until her death. The letters revealed a relationship that had evolved from mentorship to genuine care, though both had been too constrained by circumstances to acknowledge it openly. Reading these letters together became a family ritual. Each evening they would gather in Paul's study, taking turns reading Kelly's words aloud. Through her perspective, they began to see each other differently. Paul gained insight into the remarkable woman his protégé had become. Sophie and Thomas discovered a mother who had never stopped believing in the possibility of family reconciliation. Thomas created a series of portraits based on the letters, capturing the complex emotions they contained. One particular piece, showing Kelly, Paul, and Robert in imagined reconciliation, moved Paul to tears. But he had it hung in the manor's main hall, a testament to both loss and hope. The process of acceptance extended beyond their immediate family. Paul began hosting regular dinners for the Harrison House community, acknowledging the role they had played in supporting his grandchildren. Sophie initiated a scholarship program for children of single parents, naming it after her mother. Thomas organized art therapy workshops for young people dealing with family separation. Their healing became a model for others, demonstrating that forgiveness didn't require forgetting, that acceptance could coexist with accountability. The Durant family story, once a cautionary tale of pride and separation, transformed into an example of how broken relationships could be rebuilt through honesty, effort, and the courage to change. 1 year after Paul's hospitalization, the Durant family gathered at their restored family estate to commemorate not just survival but transformation. The mansion, once a monument to corporate success, had been renovated to reflect their healed relationships, with Thomas's artwork adorning walls that had previously displayed only business achievements. Paul Durant, now fully recovered and semi-retired, stood in the garden where he had supervised the planting of a memorial grove in Kelly's honor. Each tree represented a year of her life, with the centerpiece being a mature oak under which she and Robert had once planned their future. The evening light filtered through the leaves, casting gentle shadows on the gathering of people who had become their extended family. Mrs. Martinez and the Harrison House staff mingled comfortably with Durant Industries executives. The social barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had dissolved in the wake of their shared journey. Elizabeth Harrison, watching Sophie confidently discussing foundation policies with board members, reflected on how far they had all come from those first tense meetings in her office. The celebration took an unexpected turn when Paul called for everyone's attention. Standing beside the oak tree with Sophie and Thomas flanking him, he announced the establishment of the Kelly Durant Center for Family Reunification. The center would provide legal assistance, counseling, and support services to separated families, with a special focus on helping children maintain connections with absent parents. A year ago, Paul addressed the gathering, his voice strong despite his emotion. "I thought legacy meant leaving behind buildings and bank accounts. Today I understand that true legacy lives in the relationships we nurture and the healing we facilitate." Sophie, now in her first year of law school and already interning with family court advocates, spoke about their plans to reform the foster care system. Her passionate articulation of their mission reminded many of Kelly's determination years ago. Thomas, having recently received recognition for his series of paintings documenting their family's journey, unveiled his latest work, a triptych showing their transformation from separation to reunion. The evening's most poignant moment came when Paul presented Sophie and Thomas with updated family portraits. Unlike the formal, staged photographs that had traditionally lined the manor's halls, these captured genuine moments, Sophie helping Paul with physical therapy, Thomas teaching his grandfather to sketch, the three of them laughing together in the kitchen. Alongside these new images hung carefully preserved photographs of Kelly and Robert, acknowledging that healing didn't mean forgetting, but integrating past and present. As twilight settled over the gathering, Paul watched his grandchildren moving confidently among the guests, each carrying forward different aspects of their parents' legacy. In Sophie's determined advocacy and Thomas's artistic sensitivity, he saw not just echoes of Robert and Kelly, but the emergence of something new, a family identity forged through adversity and strengthened by choosing love over pride. The Harvard Law School orientation ceremony fell silent as Sophie Durant took the podium as the incoming class speaker. Her selection had raised eyebrows among those who recognized the Durant name, but her application essay about family law reform had earned her this platform on its own merits. When I was 12. She began, her voice steady and clear. I believed that justice was simple, a straight line between right and wrong. My mother had died, my father was absent, and my grandfather seemed to represent everything that had gone wrong in our lives. The law, I thought, existed to punish those who caused harm and protect those who suffered it. Paul and Thomas sat in the audience, watching Sophie command the attention of future lawyers, judges, and legislators. Her professional attire and confident bearing couldn't quite hide the passionate advocate who had once fought so fiercely to protect her brother. But life taught me that justice without understanding is incomplete, she continued. Through my own family's journey, I learned that the law must do more than assign blame or determine custody. It must create pathways for healing, frameworks for reconciliation, and mechanisms for families to rebuild what circumstances or choices have broken. Sophie detailed her experiences with the family court system, not as a victim seeking redress, but as someone who had witnessed both its limitations and its potential. She spoke of the Kelly Durant Center's early successes in reuniting families, of the legislative reforms they were already pursuing, of the need for legal professionals who understood that family law was about more than winning cases. My mother was a scholarship student who fell in love with the son of her mentor, Sophie revealed, her voice softening. Their story could have been a testament to breaking down social barriers. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about pride, fear, and the ways our legal system can sometimes perpetuate family separations rather than heal them. In the audience, Paul wiped away tears as Sophie acknowledged their shared history without bitterness. Thomas, sitting beside him, captured the moment in his sketchbook, his sister standing tall at the podium, their grandfather moved by her words, the distinguished assembly hanging on every word of a story that was both deeply personal and universally relevant. I stand before you today, not just as a Durant, Sophie concluded, but as someone who has seen how the law can either divide or unite families. My goal in studying law isn't to win cases, but to change how we think about justice in family matters. Because sometimes the most important legal victories aren't won in courtrooms, but in living rooms where families find their way back to each other. The applause that followed wasn't merely polite, it carried the weight of recognition. Sophie had given voice to an aspect of legal practice that transcended traditional notions of winning and losing. As she returned to her seat, several professors were already making notes about involving her in their family law reform initiatives. The final family portrait session took place in Clay's Memorial Grove on a crisp autumn morning. Paul had commissioned a renowned photographer to capture what he called their second chance at family, but it was Thomas's artistic direction that shaped the moment. Instead of the formal, staged compositions that had traditionally marked Durant family milestones, Thomas envisioned something more authentic. He arranged the setting beneath the oak tree where his parents had once dreamed of their future, positioning easels displaying his artwork, chronicling their journey through pain to reconciliation. Paul sat in the center, no longer the imposing patriarch, but a grandfather who had learned to value love over legacy. Sophie stood to his right, her law school acceptance letter framed alongside her mother's scholarship certificate, representing the intersection of past and present. Thomas positioned himself on Paul's left, his latest sketchbook open to show the evolution of their family story. The photographer captured a series of unscripted moments, Paul showing Sophie and Thomas old photographs of Robert as a child, Sophie explaining her latest legal reform proposal, while Paul listened with genuine interest, Thomas sketching quick portraits of them all. Each image reflected the natural warmth that had replaced their former tension. The most poignant moment came when Mrs. Martinez arrived with a surprise, a recently discovered photograph of Kelly, Robert, and Paul together at a Durant Foundation event years before the conflicts began. As they studied the old image, the photographer caught their spontaneous reactions, Sophie's hand reaching for her grandfather's, Thomas's thoughtful gaze, Paul's tears of recognition. The final portrait, selected unanimously by the family, wasn't the most technically perfect shot. Instead, they chose one that captured them in mid-conversation, their faces animated with genuine emotion. Paul was gesturing as he shared a memory. Sophie was laughing despite herself, and Thomas was adding quick sketches to his ever-present notebook. Behind them, through the branches of Kiale's oak tree, sunlight created a natural halo effect. This image, now hanging in the manor's great hall, told the story of a family that had learned that perfection matters less than authenticity, that healing doesn't erase scars but gives them meaning, that love can bridge even the widest gaps created by pride and fear. Beside it hung Thomas's final triptych of their journey, the first panel showing their fractured beginnings, the second depicting their confrontation with truth, and the third illustrating their hard-won unity. Together, the photographs and paintings testified to the possibility of redemption, the power of perseverance, and the profound truth that family bonds, though tested by circumstance, can emerge stronger for having been broken and carefully, lovingly rebuilt. As Paul often remarked, while showing visitors these images, our family portrait isn't just about who we are now. It's about who we were, who we've become, and most importantly, who we choose to be for each other every day forward. What do you think about this powerful story of family redemption? We'd love to hear your perspective on how pride and fear can tear families apart, and how forgiveness and understanding can bring them back together. Have you experienced similar challenges in rebuilding broken family relationships? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found meaning and inspiration in this story of healing and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We share touching stories of family reconciliation, personal growth, and the triumph of love over pride every week. Join our community of readers who believe in the power of forgiveness. Every story of healing deserves to be shared. If this tale of the Durant family touched your heart or made you reflect on your own family relationships, please share it with others who might need its message of hope. Together, we can inspire more families to choose understanding over judgment and love over pride. Your share could be the catalyst someone needs to take the first step toward reconciliation.